for coming, especially folks that came down here from Eureka, Arcata, and McKinleyville. I appreciate having everybody coming down here. I also want to thank the Historical Society for inviting me to present today. I've been focused on this topic for a while now, and anybody that knows me knows I am always eager to share stories. So I'm really happy to be here to share some stories with you. So we get started here. So why am I focused on the brothels, the early sex industry basically in Humboldt County? Well, I've been a historian for a very long time, and I really hadn't given much thought to that aspect of Humboldt County's history until COVID. So I have a history blog, as Mark mentioned, and during COVID I lived about a mile from Old Town, and I'd go down to Old Town and I'd pick a cool building, and then I'd come home because I'm a dork, and then I'd try to find a newspaper article or something, and then write something, post something. Well, I was on the waterfront of Eureka looking at that big old parking lot. And for people that are familiar with Eureka, next to where Dick Taylor Chocolates is now, big old parking lot, empty. I thought, well, something must have been here. And so I found an old map that mentioned the Scandia Hotel. Got a really great picture of Scandia there. And then I dove into local newspaper articles looking for information. And what I found was a story about a woman named Virginia Giffray. In the early 1900s, her husband had left her and her 6 children. So there she is, alone raising 6 kids. She goes to work as a chambermaid in the Scandia Hotel, and the 2 owners tried to, quote, force her into a life of shame. She resisted. And the story was about that. But that really, for me, I'd heard little snippets about Eureka being an open town and wild area and open north of 4th and all of that. But I never really looked into it until I ran across this story. And then another story. And then another story. And my problem today really was cutting down the stories that I was going to share with you. So when I start looking into this, we know that Eureka, bustling, really vibrant old town area, downtown area in the 1800s and early 1900s. Lots of photos, we hear about lots of men. But if you look more carefully, the women that I'm going to talk about today, they were there too. Their names aren't on the buildings, we don't necessarily mention their names, or frankly even know their names, because a lot of them assumed kind of work names when they went into this particular line of work because they didn't want their family or other people to find out what they did. They didn't want their shame to spread. But these women were here, and there were a lot of them. But I'm going to back up. So I was very excited that I would be down in Fortuna today. And how many people are from Fortuna, Rohnerville, kind of Eel River Valley? We've got some, not a ton. Okay, well, we have a few. Well, this is Henry Rohner. And one of the first stories that I learned about prostitution in Humboldt County actually involved Henry Rohner. So Henry Rohner was apparently a very nice guy. In the 1850s even, he had property down here, he had a ranch down here, but he was helping the local newspaper editor as a typesetter. So he would go up north, and he would actually work in the newspaper office. And he was up there when, oops, let me back up a little here. There we go. So he was up there when a disgruntled customer, as it was put in the Historical Society newsletter, came in very upset. And this guy said that the editor of the paper, his name was Grunman, the editor had called Grunman a sucker. I didn't know that was an insult in the 1850s, but apparently it was. And Mr. Rohner here defended his boss. So Stephen Grunman picked up a gun and shot Henry Rohner. And they were afraid that it was going to kill him. So a ruffian, Grunman, and that's pretty much where the story ends. But when the editor reported on this story, he actually said it was humiliating. Absolutely humiliating to tell the story. So this is the 1850s in Arcata, and the reason it was humiliating is because Stephen Grunman owned a brothel. And in the 1850s, Arcata must have seen itself as becoming refined and beyond that sort of thing. But because Henry Rohner was shot by a pimp, he had to admit that this particular industry existed in Humboldt County. So why? Why does the industry exist? I'm sure we've all thought about it a little bit, but it's really more complicated than that. So if you think of Humboldt County was incredibly isolated, right? People, the early settlers, gold miners, lots of young men. Frankly, lots of young, lonely men. So that was a part of it. And this was Trinity County, but Humboldt was the same. So, and the editor was being sort of sarcastic when he said that they ought to ship a bunch of women up to Trinity County because there were so many single men that wanted to get married, and what was it, 5 or 6 marriageable women. And these guys were lonely, right? They're just like anybody else. There was also, if there were other women there was a big taboo against premarital sex. Right? Didn't really happen. And there were also big concerns if you're a young man by yourself and you've got certain needs, meeting those needs by yourself was considered dangerous. Doctors, and I thought about bringing a medical book here, medical doctors would warn young men that self-abuse could cause sterility, impotence, and I actually had the admission records from the Stockton State Asylum, and doctors there would list self-abuse as the only reason for insanity. So when I puzzled this out, though, if you think about that for a minute, and there's an unstable young man in front of you, and I'm a doctor and I'm trying to figure out why he's here, I could see the doctor going, well, do you engage in this activity? And the young man might be, yes, and the doctor would be like, well, that's why you're here. That explains it. And write that down as the cause. So those were some of the needs that men had. Now what about women? There was no social services, there was no food stamps. Women really were raised and expected to be midwives and mothers. If that didn't happen, if they were spinsters and they were supposed to stay home and take care of their parents, that was kind of the expected trajectory. But not all women got married. Not all parents were around, right? So sometimes single women spinsters were on their own. And marriages didn't always work out. It was dangerous. It was a very dangerous time to live. Sometimes women were widowed. Sometimes men would go out for that proverbial pack of cigarettes and never come back. It happened a lot. And so women also got put in a place where they needed to make money, they needed to survive, especially if they had children, and especially if those children couldn't yet work and help support a family. So women also had this need to make money, and legitimate employment, frankly, didn't pay a lot. It didn't pay a lot at all. It was dangerous. There was violence, disease. There are other things that made that occupation dangerous, but you also have to think, okay, if I am a woman in the 1800s, even in the early 1900s, my expectation was to stay home, maybe join some sewing circles or whatever. Boring. But for a lot of women, boring. Once a woman kind of realized that in this occupation you could have your own money, you could travel, you could do what you wanted to do, for a lot of women that was attractive. And for some even that maybe tried to get out of that profession, once they knew freedom, it was kind of hard to give that up. So you had these two things come together. And the profession existed, right, in California. So California early on, especially in the gold rush, there was a lot of this going on. Not everybody was happy with it, and even more people were okay with it, but didn't want to see it. So a lot of the laws that were set up as early as 1855 vacancy laws, right, they were designed, frankly, more to control where prostitution happened, not stop it. So that happened at the state level, it happened a lot at the local levels. Now what about Humboldt? If you were living in Humboldt County, where did you work? There are very few what they call cribs. So in San Francisco and other cities, they would build, literally when these women went to work in this occupation, they would build specific buildings that were small and that were kind of purpose-built for this. I'm not seeing much evidence that Eureka had many of those. This is Chinatown, and there may very early have been some in Chinatown, but cribs didn't seem to exist. Women did work in lodging houses, above saloons, above restaurants, that sort of thing. But most of the women worked in dedicated brothels. So basically these were built as dwellings or houses that got converted, and then they were only used for that particular business. And most of these were actually referred to as resorts. So this is actually, these are two resorts that were over on B Street. This one was on the corner of 4th and C Streets, and this was actually the largest that Eureka had, at least in the early 1900s. So this was also a resort. This is one in Arcata, and I'll talk a little bit about Arcatas in a bit here. So how did they enter the life? In Humboldt County, there was a lot of different ways it could happen. A lot of women came from outside Humboldt County. This prized gentleman here on the right with the very young girl on the far right, he married her when she was in high school and then put her to work. The woman on the left here, it looked like she was working independently. This was a little later than the time that I focus on, but that was a couple of the ways. Aggie Kelly here. So Aggie was in San Francisco, and she promised a girl named Sophia Feingold, that was her name, that there was a theater troupe in Eureka looking for help. And Sophia's family was poor. She didn't have many prospects in the city, so Aggie convinced her to come up to Humboldt County. The woman that met her at the steamer brought her into her house, said the theater troupe was still forming, and it took a little while for Sophia to realize that she was in a resort. She was there for a couple of weeks, and then actually her brother came and got her, so she was able to escape from that particular life. These two fine gentlemen met two sisters that were in Eureka in the early 1900s. Now, a lot of men that were looking for women basically to live off of would often target orphans, and that's what these two gentlemen did. They promised these two girls marriage and a better life, got them up to Portland, and then gave them absolutely the opposite. So these were the first two men convicted under the Federal White Slave Act of 1910. So they were actually caught, prosecuted, and sent to prison. So women were here, men were here, the business was here. How did it work within the county? Different places, different attitudes, different communities approached it very, very differently. Scotia. So Emerson's Saloon and Brothel was located just outside of Scotia. This is 1904, and that's what they called it, Emerson's Saloon and Brothel. Everybody knew, even though this, again, it was illegal by state law, right? Social evil, mill town, a lot of lumber workers. It was a busy place. The story I found here, so in 1904, there was a bunch of men that came into the saloon and said, this is a stick-up. And literally the people at the bar thought they were joking until they pulled out their guns. So everybody lined up, the heavily masked men took all everybody's money, except for when there was one man that had money in a little bag, dropped it on the floor, and then stepped on it to hide it. So he got to hold some of his money. Everybody else in the saloon was cleaned out. They then noticed there was a door between the saloon and the brothel. A woman, maybe because it was quiet, because you can imagine it getting pretty quiet when everybody's being robbed. Now the thing about these women is they weren't delicate flowers. And so one of the women opened the door, and the robber said, come out here and join the rest of the bunch. And the woman replied, not on your life, and slammed the door. And no one in the brothel got robbed that night. So what about Rohnerville? So Rohnerville burned down in the 1890s, but before, Rohnerville was kind of like Scotia. They had opium dens, they had brothels, they were really pretty open about the whole thing. There was a young woman who had worked throughout the county, but by the 1880s she was working and living in Rohnerville. She had a little house. There was a man named William Tungate who heard that his sister, whose name was Love, which was kind of interesting, but what William had heard is that his sister was hanging out in Annie's brothel. Annie was a young woman in her early 20s. So William was very upset that his sister was working in this place, hanging out in this place. Annie was sitting in a restaurant in Rohnerville. And because of the later description, I actually know it was on this side of the street, kind of against the hill. For folks that are familiar with Rohnerville Road, you can kind of picture it. So Annie's sitting there eating. William Tungate comes in, walks up to her, has a gun, and shoots. And it misfires. He tries again, and it misfires. The woman running the restaurant looks at her and says, "Run!" So Annie gets up, and she runs out the back, and she is running up the hill. William shoots at her as she's running out, and he misses her. So she is running up the hill, and he comes out after her, and she falls. And he walks up to her, and he has the gun, and he shoots it again, and it misfires. And by then, other people in Rohnerville have been notified what's going on, and they captured Mr. Tungate, and he went to prison. He actually got sent to San Quentin, which is something else. So what these ladies were doing was illegal, but because there was tolerance in some of these communities, law enforcement would step up. They could actually ask for and get protection from authorities while doing their line of work. That doesn't always happen when you're working in an illegal business. So the other thing about Annie, and I cannot make this connection, but there was a young woman named Annie Martin in Rohnerville about this time in her early 20s that became sick, very sick. And this is the only town where I've seen this, that the women of the Methodist Church actually held a fundraiser to help pay for Annie's doctor bills. I can't absolutely guarantee that this Annie and that Annie are the same, but it's pretty likely, especially because Bessie Gordon. So Bessie Gordon was there in 1895, I believe, and she was in the same industry. She somehow, with a cigarette, caught her clothes on fire and ended up badly burned. She's on her own. It's not like there was health insurance, right? But what happened, April 1895, some of the noble-hearted women have been in constant attendance upon her. Her character, her occupation, and her depravity were forgotten in the face of the fact that she was friendless and penniless. This is literally the only instance I've found so far in Humboldt County where society women help a fallen woman. It's pretty amazing. I mean, Rohnerville, it was very progressive, and Rohnerville was a rougher town, and so maybe some of these ladies, the ladies that helped her, had been where Bessie had been, or maybe they knew how close they were to ending up in that same situation. But their generosity was certainly more than the newspaper editors when they wrote this story. So what about other towns? So Blue Lake. So this is Ida Rose Shea, and I actually have this. This is a picture of Ida. I was able to track down some of her family up in Oregon. So Ida Rose Shea had come from Oregon. She was in Blue Lake by 1900, where she married that man. That man is George Rose Shea. They had a hard time. They had some property. They ended up with some property between Blue Lake and Corbell, but they struggled to the point where in 1905, George there was stealing chickens. He got caught and was sent to San Quentin for a year for stealing chickens. So George is gone now. Ida's got children. There's no welfare, and so Ida opens a resort. But Ida's trying to do it right. And one of the things in resorts like this, liquor sales were huge. A lot of men went just as much to drink and socialize as anything else, and then maybe they'd end the evening in the company of a lady. So Ida wanted to do this right, and she applied for a liquor license. But there were church folks in town that had a very hard time with the idea of granting this particular woman, because everybody knew what she did, a liquor license. A question of character, place has a bad name. She actually fought when they were going to deny the liquor license, and people ended up in court testifying. Most of the young men were 17 to 21 years old. And they did, in fact, say that Ida was in the business that everybody thought she was in. So she was denied the liquor license. But Blue Lakers must have understood her position, right? It's not like she was moving into anybody's house and anybody was taking her kids. So they let her keep operating. And we know this because there was a gentleman that committed suicide in 1911 at her resort, very clear where she was and what she was doing. In 1914, an inmate, which is another term that was used for the boarders of the prostitutes that were in the brothels, she set the place on fire and it burned down, but the city actually, or the county actually let her rebuild it. It wasn't until 1917 when the county moved, there was a Red Light Abatement Act, and I'll talk a little bit about more about that later, but that was during kind of the height of the reform movement, and these houses were being shut down everywhere, and that is when they actually moved to shut her down. But she held on to her property, and in 1920, actually, she started bootlegging with her boys. And so that's what she was doing, and everybody knew that too. And I actually know because she got in trouble a couple times. But it didn't stop her, right? It was a way to make money, and it's not like women could make money any other way. The interesting thing about Ida is she died in Blue Lake. The funeral was in a church, and she was buried in the cemetery. There are other towns that literally buried fallen women outside of the normal cemetery grounds. So even though the entire community out there knew what she did, they accepted her as a part of the community, which I thought was kind of cool. Ferndale. Oops. So I've told this story a couple times. So Ferndale, maybe not quite so open. So Ferndale had a house on the hill, and everybody knew about it. And in 1892, there was a woman named Edna Gardner. Her real name was Minnie French. And her husband had disappeared. He had just disappeared. She didn't know where he was. And she had a little girl. So she's trying to better her life. She probably worked on the house on the hill, though I haven't found that out for sure. But in 1892, she bought a lot in Ferndale. So for folks that know Ferndale, where the steeple is, or the old Methodist church there, this is the church. So there we go, look at that. And she bought property right here. So you can imagine people weren't thrilled, right? House on the hill was there. So Edna gets a contractor and she starts building. The day the contractor started, he must have gotten a lot done actually when I think about it, because that night, 9 o'clock that night, the wives and daughters of Ferndale's prominent citizens showed up at Edna's house with a horse and a rope. They tied that rope around a corner of the foundation and pulled. So they'd actually undermined a corner of the structure when the constable showed up and stopped them. So he stopped them. Edna kept building. Within a week or two, she was charged with running a house of prostitution. All right? Trial happened in what's now the Portuguese Hall. It was the Russ Hall at the time. Overflowing, you can imagine, kind of audience might want to watch that sort of thing. Well, she was acquitted because, of course, the house wasn't even open. She convicted her running it. So she was acquitted. Not everybody was happy about it, but that's what happened. She kept building. She started receiving guests in the house. We'll put it that way. And people weren't upset about it. In May, they tried prosecuting her again, and she was acquitted again, which, again, some of the proper ladies in Ferndale were just up in arms, but the jury's like, we didn't have the proof. And so after she was acquitted, neighbors filed under the Nuisance Abatement Act to shut her down, right? So that's how they were going to do it, except rumors then started floating that people had been watching her house and writing down the names of the visitors. So when that nuisance abatement trial happened, it was rumored that these guys were going to be called as witnesses. So it wasn't too long after that. Oh, there we go, sorry. I That's what I was talking about. Yes, okay, sorry. So let me just say this, is, so when she was prosecuted, literally the paper's like, cottage on the hill is enough. If we're gonna have a house, we'll have a house, but just the one. We don't need another one. So in May, right, everybody's got rumors that the visitors are gonna be called. The night watchman smells smoke. Comes around the corner and shockingly, her house is on fire. There's no formal fire department, so they finally get it together enough to pull a hose. First hose is too short, can't reach her house. Get a second hose has got a hole in it, so they can't do it. By the time they get a working hose, her entire house is gone, as is the town hall next door. So she gives up, excuse me. So she gives up, she leaves town. Ferndale has got at least the one. The Red Light Abatement Act happens again. They try to close the houses down in 1917, but it really isn't until 1922 that Ferndale says they're gone. We don't have these ladies anymore. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. Arcata. This is kind of fascinating to me because a lot of people think of Arcata being very progressive, very open. Yeah, with Grundman, if you think back to poor Henry Rohner being shot in Arcata, right, and how humiliating it was to even admit that there was a house of prostitution in Arcata. Well, Grundman didn't even leave then, and this is thanks to Alex Service that we know this. There was a woman named Carity Meg, I'm guessing she had red hair, that was working at Grundman's house a couple of years after Henry Rohner was shot. So they did not have any luck getting rid of Grundman. It wasn't until he was accused of murder a couple of years later that we finally drove that man out of town. So houses were there in the 1850s all the way through the 1880s. I found a note where two people were running a house and they got kicked out. In 1894, there was a woman named Clara Williams living in a place called The Hollow. Is anybody from Arcata ever heard that reference to Arcata? I still can't figure out where that was, but that apparently was where the houses of ill repute were. So Clara was there in the 1890s. But by the early 1900s, Arcata was kind of done with this. There was a man named William Lindsay, who people may know, very old Arcata family. His house happened to be near a house of ill repute. And he was absolutely horrified because the ladies next door would do their thing without closing the curtains. Why he kept looking up there? Making their toilet, but scantily dressed, if dressed at all. So he was just scandalized by this whole thing. These ladies were kicked out. They were run out of town. But people didn't give up quite yet. So there was a woman named Minnie Lewis. So Minnie's the one that had that largest house in Eureka. In the early 1900s, she literally looked to expand, kind of like a franchise. And madams would do this. Once they'd established a successful house, if they could find someone to manage it, like any other business person, quite frankly, they would try to open more. So Minnie, do people recognize this house? Oh yeah. So this is Minnie's house. She leased it, she ran it. But the people in Arcata, this is 10th and F Street for people who are not familiar with Arcata. So this is literally just a couple blocks off the plaza. And one of the things about these particular businesses is they were not quiet at night. And it wasn't necessarily the noise you're thinking, but people would drink. Men would drink before they went. Men would drink when they were there. Women would be laughing and giggling. It was very loud and disruptive. And this was in a residential area. They got a state. They got the state to step in to shut Minnie down. So she's done. They're out. There may have been, some subtle women working very carefully, but Arcata wasn't having it. And then, I'll just do that. Okay. And then there's Eureka. This is what Eureka looked like early on. Pretty darn rough, right? So ladies were, in the early days, ladies were working along First Street, the steamers were coming in, guests were coming in, loggers are coming in, sailors, lots of sailors in and out, and so the ladies were right there on Front Street. But as Eureka grew, things kind of changed, right? Those rough frame dwellings were literally sometimes picked up and moved. And they would move them kind of south and west. So think towards the co-op, for folks that are familiar with Eureka. And these types of buildings took their place. These gentlemen in the 1880s pictured Eureka as kind of the San Francisco of the North. And having wanton women wandering the sidewalks, not so much in keeping with their vision. They had opera houses, ornate buildings, even the market was lovely. And so in March of 1885, and there were others before this, the city of Eureka passed an ordinance limiting, or basically it was supposed to be prohibiting this particular business. But really, again, Eureka didn't want these girls and their business to go away. They just didn't want it in everybody's face. And if you think about this particular business, it brought men in, brought in their money, right? It's not like if a man went to a resort, he was there for hours and hours and that was the only place he spent his money. He'd go to saloons beforehand, he'd maybe go visit a lady, he'd come back to a saloon, he'd sleep in a lodging house. If he needed new boots, well, if he's already in Eureka, that's where he'd spend his money. The other thing about Eureka and money is the rental income. So there were a lot of property owners. As this particular industry grew, it made a lot of money because women couldn't locate wherever they wanted, and not every property owner wanted to rent to them. So property owners that were willing to rent for this particular industry could charge double rent easy. And so Eureka went, yeah, okay, I'll take them. By 1896, this gives you some idea of Eureka's attitude. When they're on duty, if you've got to tell officers, no, you can't go hang out in a brothel when you're working, that tells you something about their attitude. So this, I didn't have time to do the entire progression, but I actually have a series of maps that shows how the houses of ill repute moved off the waterfront and southeast towards the co-op. And the district, when the district was defined, our red light district in Eureka, it was Front Street to 5th, A to E. So it was a defined district. And you can see, and it's maybe kind of hard to see, but basically the one on the end, here we go. This is 4th Street. And so it started on the waterfront, moved like 3rd, the shanty, if anybody wants to admit they know what shanty is. The shanty in that area, and then really collected here around the co-op and down 4th Street. And so by 1900, there were literally over 30 dedicated brothels. 30 converted dwellings specifically operated as resorts. So this gives you maybe a better, easier way. So this is where the co-op is now, 4th and B. This is what it used to look like. These, unfortunately, I'm still, if anybody has photos of this area, I'd pay you money. Because people, it's so weird that people didn't take pictures of the brothels they were going to. But it's really hard to find photos. And so anyway, so this is 4th and B. This is the same area where the co-op is. This house on the corner here is new, but these two houses were houses of ill repute. These ones are ones I showed you earlier. If people can recognize there that that's housing, that is, you see Minnie's house there? That big old, this was, as far as I can tell, at least in the early 1900s, this is the largest house. She had 6, 7 bedrooms. She had a couple of parlors. I mean, it was a fancy, it was mahogany furniture, bird's eye furniture in the bedrooms. Like, this was a plush place. She did do well. She had racehorses. She leased a ranch in Rio Del. Like, yeah, she was quite the entrepreneur. But then unfortunately there were also, not so nice houses, and women had to live there too. Women also scattered, of course, 2nd Street, but they had to be careful, right? They had to stay within this district. So how did Eureka handle it? So Eureka in 1888 had passed an 11 o'clock ordinance which required saloon owners to stop serving alcohol at 11 o'clock. Saloon owners got angry when their customers would leave their saloons at 11. So 1888, and then this happened again in 1900, so I'll just explain this. So they complained that these women were leaving their businesses, they weren't making any more money, and they were just going down the street to the brothels where the madams kept serving liquor. In 1888, they tried prosecuting the women. It just didn't go well. They had private investigators and secret, it just did not go well. The city spent a lot of money, didn't make any money. 1900, the city handled it a little differently. And basically, they went to the women and said, look, all these guys are complaining, right? We can shut you down, or we can charge you for selling liquor without a license. You can plead guilty, pay your bail, just don't show up in court, which means you're forfeiting your bail, and then we'll leave you alone for a while. And so that's what they did in 1900. And these are the women that paid $30 each, which was a lot of money back then. And so then they went on their way. In 1901, city's getting broker and broker. One of the councilmen suggested actually taxing the women of the district. But then they were reminded that the women were working illegally. So taxing these women for being criminals really wasn't going to work so well. 1902, the city was broke, right? And it's the minutes of this meeting, the city council meeting, is basically they're going, well, we need to pay the school bills, we need to pay this, we need to pay this. Hey, chief, go arrest all the women again. And they did. They lined the women up again. The women pled guilty, forfeited their $30 bail, and they moved on. Well, 1903 was a little different. So Eureka at that point is broke, like seriously broke. And in the spring, they're like, well, let's just round these women, let's just do that again. That was awesome, it worked. And the chief is like, so the women were willing to show up, right? And you were charging them with a crime, they were pleading guilty, and they were paying. They don't want to do that anymore. I don't think they're going to show up, because you're not giving them trials, you're basically accusing them of being criminals, but you're not giving them any time in court. I don't think these women are going to show up. And the city council went, go do it anyway. And the women didn't show up. Right? It wasn't an official charge. Nobody had proof, right? So they were pleading guilty to something, every single one of them, when maybe some of them weren't selling. Most probably were, but nobody had proved it. So they were tired of that. But city was broke, really, really broke. They then talked about, well, let's charge the women for being in a house, right? Running a house. And then somebody said, but that's a state law. And so the fines go to the county. The city's not getting any of that money. And they went, well, that's not going to work because we want the money. So in September, they actually passed an ordinance that that upped the fine to $500 if you were convicted of running a house. And the fines were like, or 6 months in jail. Like they really upped it, right? And the odds of actually convicting women, because you'd need witnesses willing to testify in court, the odds were low, but that, I think, was the leverage that the city needed to charge the women again. And so in October, they all lined up and they paid their fine. And it started a system. So in the fall of 1903, it wasn't documented as such, there wasn't an ordinance that said so, but basically once or twice a year, even police officers would go into the district and tell the ladies, okay, tomorrow's the day you're going to get arrested, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, show up in court. They would all stand up, they'd all plead guilty, they'd pay their bail, and then they just wouldn't show up. So that's in some ways harsh, depends on who you talk to and the position you take, but it was giving them permission to operate, and it was also creating this agreement because some of these customers were violent, right? Things would happen. And because they had this kind of agreement with the police and with the city, when things happened, they called the police, and the police came. Officers patrolled the red light district where drunk men ended up all the time, as you can imagine. And so officers, it really was something that worked for both for a very long time. Oh, and this is a list. I mean, I've got the names of every single madam that paid into the city of Eureka. I actually, at the Historical Society, which is an incredible resource for everyone, there's EPD's cash book, which lists every single woman that ever paid. Which is just, I just found that literally the other day. Fascinating. So 1907. So the reform movement, nationally, people are starting to complain about kind of this open door policy the community had. Communities had gambling, drinking. For some reason, prostitution, not so much of a thing, which is kind of unusual. But the city was getting hit a little bit, and they were getting criticized for allowing the district to be open. They were getting a lot of money from these women, right? And the property owners, again, were making a lot of money. And so what the city, by the fall, what they did is they defined the district, as I'd said, waterfront to 5th, A to E, and told the women they had to stay there. If they were caught outside of the district at night, they were arrested. Which was actually better than what that guy, which C.S. Ricks, had come up with. So when they were complaining, he actually suggested an enclosure. And you're laughing, but Sacramento did it, and so did LA. Ricks here suggested half a block and a 15-foot fence around. And then you make the women stay inside. So funny, but not. But fortunately, that didn't happen, and frankly, property owners didn't want it to happen, right? Because if all the women were moved out, they were out of luck. So the women were confined to the district. Women who were caught were fined as much as $50, which was $1,500. Women got tired of it. So they did, in fact, contract to build a boat. A pleasure craft. It was in Eureka for a time, but if you can imagine the noise, it was parked at Indian Island or Tuluat Island. But the noise traveled across into Eureka, and Eureka went, we're not having this. So they moved it to Arcata. You can imagine how Arcata felt about that. So they moved them out of Arcata. The ladies actually bought a piece of property in Fields Landing and were going to ground the boat. But a night watchman stood at the railroad tracks and kept it out until he got an injunction. So that did not happen. Fast life. So what happened in Eureka? So reform movement's happening nationwide. There were a bunch of things that were happening. Even people we need to clean up Eureka, we need to make a difference. There was a private attorney that filed on behalf of property owners near the district that said that the surrounding property values had been devalued by the proximity of brothels and sued to have all the women cleared out. For a while, officials argued about who would actually be in charge of pushing these women out and closing the district, but it did happen. They knew the women weren't leaving Eureka, they were just leaving that particular area. So they scattered. They went all through Eureka, and then of course that created other problems. But now this is the Pioneer Hotel on First Street, so this is First and F, that parking lot that's there. So the Pioneer Hotel was a resort. If folks have ever been to the waterfronts, there, also at First and F, the upstairs is absolutely a dedicated brothel. And then we have laundries. The laundry was actually owned by the same people that had that. And my guess is they would actually recruit from the girls that were working in the laundry and weren't making a lot of money. So it was a way for girls to make extra money. In 1816, Eureka decided they wanted to close these down, right? Things are even ramping up, pressure's ramping up. So they start closing houses. Rooming houses are being closed up. Right? An ordinance before the council, like, they're getting serious. These ladies have to stop what they're doing. And What the city said was in 1916, June of 1916, clean bill of health. All the brothels are gone, all the women are gone. We are a clean city now. Think it happened? 1925. They used the Abatement Act again. Right, and yeah, and you guys, if you're curious, you may recognize some of the last names. Scattered throughout, and as we know, these ladies, it never went away. It changed. You know, this is a woman that ran a house in 1825. So they closed officially, but not officially. The business continued. So I want to back up a little bit, just to put a little meat on one of the stories that I talked about. So the city wanted this money, right? Eureka decided they were going to keep this particular trade. The balance in Eureka, all the cash they had on hand in 1903 was $1,156. And in 1903, from the ladies, they got $840. So that gives you some idea of the amount of money that these ladies brought in over time. In 1909, there was so much money brought in that it literally overflew, it filled the table. Coins, paper money, there was an officer literally standing there to guard the money. There was so much of it. That's how much these women were building in, were bringing in. And literally the reporter said, now the city can buy more rock for the roads. These women helped to build the city's infrastructure. And this gives you some idea, right? Over time, so the total, here we go. So the actual dollar amount over those years was almost $14,000, but it added up in today's dollars, almost $500,000. Just from this particular group of women. And keep in mind, no other women in Eureka were taxed in this way. No other women were expected to pay. And yet these are women nobody talked to, nobody talked about, nobody wanted to see them. But their contribution was huge in Eureka. So I do want to end with that and let you guys know, for anybody who may be interested, because I have a pitch, the city of Eureka, I am actually working with Eureka's mayor to establish a monument, a physical monument, recognizing these women, their place in the community, and their contribution to the city of Eureka. So anybody that wants to know more about that, please, there's my email out there. Chuck can also help you get a hold of me if you want. It's a very important project, right? This was a huge part of our community, and they were allowed to be a part of our community. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. Yes, I've left some time for questions. Everybody's got them. So, questions? Anybody?
When beyond that period did it officially close, or did it ever close?
It never did. You know, it's funny. I was wondering if you think you tried. So no, I mean, it's, of course not, right? I mean, it's, and we can talk about why it did or did not. But in the 1940s, so the big thing, and this happened all over the country, and actually First World War as well. First World War, more young men were disabled during the war from diseases than from injuries. It was incredibly dangerous. So the feds would go around and have these communities close the districts. Same thing happened again during World War II. And they even came here and told Eureka, you got to shut these houses down. Of course, it didn't last. You know, here's the 50s. You know, police are clamping down again. And I could have kept going, and probably every 5-10 years, depending on who was on the city council or kind of what the feel of the town was. There were always crackdowns, but, you know, even today, right? I mean, sex workers are out there. Most of them now are connected to their customers online, but of course they still exist. Any other questions?
When's the last time the city tried to collect
I would imagine well, 1914. They did, I mean, and they said it was like a revival. So they had stopped officially in 1909, but and I haven't looked into the city's finances in 1914, but we can guess about what was going on there. But I've only gone to like 1920. That's about as far as I've gone with my research. I wouldn't be surprised if they tried in other ways. You know, but property owners too were paying property taxes, right? You know, with saloons. I mean, it's, however you feel about the industry personally, it brought in a lot of money and probably at different points helped Eureka survive as a city. Anything else?
When did you go come out?
You know, I'm working on it right now. So as soon as I can, and it's all focused on different ladies from Eureka, but they were all over the place. I mean, their histories, the women that ended up here, the histories are fascinating. I mean, and Eureka is kind of interesting in that it was on the coast. Oh, sorry, thank you. Eureka was kind of in a unique position, and that it was just, it was small and rough, but it was just a steamer ride from San Francisco. So like one of the madams that I focused on, she grew up in Oakland, right? An impoverished family, ended up running a house in prostitution and then running a house of prostitution. But San Francisco is pretty darn close to Oakland and her family. Her brother ended up becoming a police officer in Oakland. But Eureka was just a steamer ride up. It was 24 hours, really busy. I mean, if you think about it, most people probably already knew this, but it was the biggest port, busiest city between San Francisco and Portland. Everybody came through along the coast. So super busy, but the other thing about Eureka, it was also very isolated. Like you had to commit if you were coming here. You couldn't just come in and out and that sort of thing. So I think that created kind of a unique dynamic. There was also, sorry, just an aside, but one of the women that I'm focused on was Finnish. And her and her sister came into Eureka in the early 1900s. And their custom, like their resort was known as a Finnish house. Because if you think about all these immigrants that came in from all over the world, they didn't even all speak English, right? So these are young guys, far from family. Parents aren't around to watch them anymore, but they're lonely. And so there would be kind of these ethnic houses, basically, that would offer standard services, but also, I think, offer community and company for these young men that were incredibly lonely.
I wonder, Lynette, about the Emersons in Scotia. Probably should have guessed, right? I know that Evelyn McCormick said that in the end, when Pacific Lumber Company said, we don't really want that as part of our community anymore, she says that they were kicked out and were given $10,000 and moved to their present location. I wonder if you've ever heard where that present location is, or about this fantastic amount of money.
I've never heard
You've never heard that one? Yeah. Let's look into it.
Okay. Yes. I mean, there's endless, stories are endless. Yes.
I lived in a town, Montana, Miles City, Montana. They had legal prostitution there until the early 60s. And it was closed out.
I believe it.
And they had these houses at the edge of the town. Everybody knew what they were. And the ladies would go downtown once a week. The doctors would check and all that kind of thing. They have rules about that.
Yes.
Need to be clean.
Yes. That is, yes. Over time, as the industry kind of evolved, there were places and towns that would require that, health checks. So one of the interesting, and this isn't a Humboldt story, but it kind of goes to that, is there was a town in Utah, and there were brothels being run in Utah, and there were the officials, it was a mining town, and the officials closed down the brothels. And instead of going to the officials, the madams went to the owner of the mine and said, you know what, we're closed down, and when your guys get off work, do you want them coming here, or do you want them traveling for a day or two to Salt Lake? And the mine's owners went to the city officials and had those houses reopened. Anything else?
So what sort of
something to plan for the monument? Is it sort of a traditional old-fashioned statue of a woman, or is it something more abstract, or is it at that stage yet in the planning?
We are not at that stage. Julie Fulkerson, who is here and has generously offered to help. There's a couple of other people, like I said, I'm working with Kim. We are just at the beginning. We are in no way competing with the Chinatown Monument. That's amazing, and I just don't have it in me. Actually, I met with Kim and with Leslie, who's also on the city council. By the end of that conversation, they were envisioning a life-size bronze sculpture of a woman. Yeah, no, that's not happening. No, it's going to be simple, and it's just to honor, these women lived here. We know Rick's name, right? We know so many names of the men. We don't know the names of these women. They were entrepreneurs. They were here. They, some would argue they performed a service that was needed. And actually, there was a reformer, sorry, an aside, but not. There was a guy that came through in 1906, right? And he was shocked when he heard that Eureka had 30 brothels. And went to the mayor, and the mayor went, not really my area. But then, he said that society women came up to him and told him, no, we need these. We'll leave them alone. A couple different reasons for that, at least from what I've researched, and actually just thinking about it. So a few things. So proper women, right? Proper women in the Victorian era and beyond weren't really supposed to enjoy intimacy. If they did, they were thought to be deviant. And so if husbands assumed their wives weren't supposed to enjoy it, and the women did, right? So not very enjoyable for anybody, and where professional women could at least pretend they enjoyed anyway for their customers. But the other thing is birth control. So here's the thing, when everybody lived on ranches and farms and all of that, like you needed 10 kids, right? But if you're living in downtown Eureka and your husband's working at a blacksmith shop, how are you going to feed 8 or 10 kids? There wasn't a lot of birth control. Birth control didn't work well. And so I think a lot of these society women, a lot of these wives, like once they had their 2 or 3 kids, they were like, okay, honey, go that way. So that was just another aspect. And I think a reason why it was tolerated in Eureka for as long as it was.
Did you ever get more information about that woman that we talked about earlier? I think she was Hydeville or something like that.
Oh yeah, no, this is kind of interesting. Mark and I have talked about this a little bit. In all the research I've done, and I've poured through all the census records, there's only a single woman that I've been able to find in the historic census records that was labeled as a prostitute. And it was a single woman in Hydeville. No, it's kind of cute. So the census record, this is why it's cute. So the census recorder in 1880, and by then, like other Sacramento called them prostitutes, other counties were calling them harlots, and that was their occupation. But they were homemakers or housekeepers in Eureka, and I think part of it is because the census taker was a school teacher. I think he just had a hard time. Like he wasn't going to write down sex worker. I think that's why. But it's this one, the person in Hydeville clearly was a different person of a different mindset and actually wrote down this woman's occupation. But I haven't, and it's, so, so no, but I'll keep digging. I mean, and that's part of it with this particular, once you are in it, it's story after story, and then when you find out who these women were, right, because everybody thinks about them as sex workers, but they were mothers and daughters, and they were full women with full lives. They ended up in this occupation. The occupation wasn't who they were. And so when you start learning about how they're sending money home to mom, or there was one madam that was here for over 30 years and literally led a double life. So she would go back down to Oakland where her family was, the one that came up, and she had a different name up here. Her name was Kitty Warren. And she bought her family's house in Oakland and put it in her brother's name so that the family would have a house. She didn't have children of her own probably because this particular occupation, one of the occupational hazards was disease and sterility. So she didn't have children, but when she moved out, she deeded her property in Humboldt to her younger brothers, who had always struggled. So these were like, you know, next closest thing to children that she had. I mean, so these are really complicated, interesting women. Yeah, so I'll keep digging.
I just wanted to say, when I was a young adult, my mom told me stories about this too. And she said this 1951 date is very important. She worked for New Method Cleaners at that time, who serviced all the prostitution. And they were known and condoned, and they had regular health checkups by the local medical. And that's when it all came to an end, was 1951. But she, in the late 40s and early 50s, she brought clean linens to all these houses of prostitution. It was well known and condoned.
So that's another thing. If you've got stories, even just rumors about buildings or that sort of thing, I'm always digging. I mean, it may just be a little thing, but there's little threads that you pull, and amazing stories come out of just a little snippet that somebody's heard someday. Any other questions? Yes.
I'd be interested in any information you've got about medical records, if there was any midwifery going on, who was caring for these women, were they caring for each other?
So there were local physicians that responded to emergency. Unfortunately, there were a lot of medical emergencies, and Dr. Falk even, when this poor young woman committed suicide, Dr. Falk was actually, who was a very well-known prominent physician, he was the first doctor that they called. It was in the nicest house, but these doctors did respond. As far as medical checks, I have heard that by the early 1900s there were regular medical checks, but I have never been able to track down that information. When I've got more time, public health maybe has something somewhere. I would love help digging that up.
In the county hospitals.
County hospital, yeah, and that kind of acted. The county hospital is also a poorhouse. So that's where folks went for that too, or to get treated for disease. There was one young woman in particular that officials knew had been infected, and they arrested her for the sole purpose of getting her medical care because there was no other reason to do it. So different, so in that, there were also abortionists here, not necessarily good ones. And that's why I know about it. When things went wrong is really when things made the paper. So that was the case as well. But I don't think, especially in the early 1900s, there wasn't as much as long as the ladies kind of stayed out of, the nice neighborhoods, the ladies knew they needed to stay away. But I don't think there was as much stigma associated with it as you would think.
I think we're at time for questions. We can always... Perfect. Okay, well thank you, Lynette, for that great talk and the expansion a little bit on what we've already heard before. Look forward to that book at some point. So we've got a couple of quick announcements. I'm going to hand it over to Brandy real quick. Keep going.
Hi, I'm Brandy Welch-Soderberg. I'm a development associate for the Humboldt County Historical Society. Thank you for being here today. We really appreciate your support. We also have given a shout out to Miles Garrett Wines and Septentrio Winery, who were participating in our local wine tasting today. Miles drove all the way from Willow Creek today to be here, so we want to give him a special round of applause.